So today I'll be talking about the power of having a speak-up culture, having environments where employees' voice is welcome, and it's really good for business.
Wow.
What? Okay, red light means we're on. And we're live. We're live. We're live. We're here. We're here. We're live. Live from our basements. Hello, LinkedIn universe. So good to have so many of you here. Hello, everyone. Steven Shadletsky here. Delighted to be with you again. That is our cue, Gautam.
Shed, good to be with you again.
Yes, it's very good to see you. Thank you for joining us on this important day. You wrote a book called Picking Presidents, though we're not necessarily picking presidents today in the U.S.
Future presidents, perhaps.
Yeah, future presidents and those who prevail and don't prevail today in the U.S. midterm elections will certainly affect how the current president and future president governs. So it's a key day. I also know, so you've launched your book, Picking Presidents, and you have a launch event today in Maryland. So very thankful that you are joining us on what I'm sure is a busy day. I'm sure your notifications are lighting up as you're following what's going on.
A very busy day. Thanks, Shed. Yeah. So it's the launch event is in Washington, D.C., actually, at Planet Word, which is the museum that Tom Friedman's wife, founded. So if you're in DC at 6:30 tonight, get tickets and join us. It will be a blast.
Amazing. Awesome. As you're joining, I know there are a few of us here already. Please feel free to hop into the chat, say hello. Let us know where in the world you're joining us from today. We will be speaking with Gautam about U.S. politics, Canadian here, so I will plead some ignorance, though I think Canadians know a lot more about the U.S. than the U.S. know more about, Canada.
Definitely true.
Yeah, we're the creepy cousin in the attic that just looks and lurches. So we'll talk about definitely politics, but really from a slant of leadership. Gautam has some really interesting work in the books that he's written that we'll unpack. And then we'll also talk about the fact that we're both getting over colds. And also talk about leadership in general. And I'm really fascinated in what Gautam has learned from your books and studying presidential candidates and those who prevail, and how that affects just good old leadership in general. As always, hello, Kit from Oregon. Good to see you here. And please continue all to join in and say hello and where you're joining us from. And as we have this conversation, would love to hear your comments and questions for Gautam and myself as we go as well. So Gautam, we were introduced from a mutual friend, Brian Wish, had a chance to listen to your NASDAQ podcast, specifically the episode you did with Amy Edmondson. I'm a big fan of Amy and her work. She's fantastic. Loved the episode and the production on the episode. It was awesome. I think so many podcasts these days, it's just two people hopping on, you hit record, editing and production is very minimal, and boom, you have a podcast.
Thanks, Shed. No, so let me give a shout out to my team at NASDAQ who sponsor the podcast, who are amazing. So before they reached out to me to do this, one of my friends had said, you should do a podcast. And I sort of said, I just don't feel like doing it from my basement. Like that just doesn't seem right. And so apparently, so the alternate being NASDAQ, which has a team of 9 people working on it, who are phenomenal.
Wow.
So if you're listening, guys, thank you. You make me sound good.
Nice. And it is very well produced. And one of those, one of my favorite podcasts historically has been Radiolab.
Yeah.
And they do such a good job going out in the field. You're not listening to a podcast, you're listening to like an experience. Malcolm Gladwell has done this with his new book, Talking to Strangers. So anyway, really, really well done. And so keen to listen to more of those episodes. If you've yet to check out Gautam's podcast with NASDAQ, please do. So I'm wearing my bipartisan blue and red shirt today on purpose. I could have only picked red from a Canadian standpoint, but from a U.S. standpoint, bipartisan here. So tell us about sort of your body of work, how it's evolved. You wrote your first book, Indispensable, your second book, Picking Presidents, which just came out weeks ago. And I have it right here.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Always happy to see that.
Very good. Very good. So tell us sort of about what you've learned, the evolution of your work, sort of the thesis proved and indispensable, and then how it's related into what you've put out with Picking Presidents.
So think of my academic work as having two streams. One is on leadership and the other is on innovation. And so the innovation work is on technology policy and technology innovation and disruptive innovation. And in sort of my other hat, when I am not being an academic and writing books, I am head of research for Rose Park Advisors, a venture capital fund in Boston, founded by Clayton Christensen, the inventor of the author of The Innovator's Dilemma, and my sort of longtime mentor and friend. But what we're talking about is my work on leadership, which is my more academic work in books, although obviously it has a component in the financial world too. Mm-hmm. And so let's start with my first book, Chet. So my first one was Indispensable: When Leaders Really Matter. And that was an outgrowth of my dissertation. And basically, because I was a very non-traditional student, I was like, if I go do a PhD, I could always go back to the private sector or something. I don't need to be a professor. I decided I was going to take on a really big question. And the question is, when do people matter? By which I mean, when is it that individuals make history, that the choices and decisions that an individual leader made really did change the way the world works? And when is it that it's actually all just a product of larger social forces? And this is sort of not just a big question, it's the quintessential big question. You can go back to Plato and Thucydides in ancient Greece and read them discussing this question, right? And so, I was a very humble guy, and I decided I was going to answer it after but so
Plato and Gautam sit down for a conversation.
He would probably drink more than me. So what I was thinking about was, if you look at the social science on leaders, what it says on the whole is leaders don't matter much. And there are three reasons for that, right? So the first one is leaders face external constraints. They have competitors, they have markets, they have all these things that just say they can't do whatever they want. And they have internal constraints. They have culture and politics and bureaucracy and budgets, right? Would say they can't do whatever. And I see you nodding. Like everybody anyone who's ever been in a leadership position has dealt with those two things.
Yeah, or who has viewed politics for any matter of moments. Yes,
that's right.
Yeah,
but the really, really important thing, the thing that makes, say, leaders be what I call fungible, right, interchangeable, is that for the big, powerful organizations that make a big difference in the world, they don't pick their leaders randomly. They pick them through a process. And that process evaluates the candidates for leadership and examines them and might spend decades getting to know everything there is to know about them. And so when it finally picks a leader, they know what this person's going to do. And if it wasn't what they wanted, they would just pick someone else who would do what they wanted to do, right? And that doesn't mean that it's not important that you have a skilled leader. Think of it like a light bulb, right? Light bulbs are important because you can't read in the dark. But it doesn't actually matter which light bulb you get. They're all the same.
Sure, whether you like white light or yellow light or whatever, but its function is the same.
Is the same. That's right. So that's the concept that you're thinking of. But what I said, as as is often true in the social sciences, is it's true except when it isn't. So I think that's a good description of the leadership of, say, McKinsey or Goldman Sachs or companies like that, right? Or Walmart, where you have to work your way up the ranks. You have to be evaluated. You have to be what I call filtered. But imagine a leader who takes power over an organization without being filtered. Maybe they inherit the job. Maybe they get hired from the outside. Maybe the corporate jet crashes and they're the only person left, right? You could imagine any number of different scenarios. And when that happens, those people have not been fully evaluated. And they can be very, very different from all the other people who might have gotten the job. And because they're different, they can make different, unique choices that no one else would have made. And when they make that kind of choice, what do we know about choices that no one else in the world would make? What we know is they are really high variance. They're either brilliantly successful or disastrous failures, but they're almost never boring. So these unfiltered leaders, these are the ones who make a difference, who have a high impact, because they're the ones who do things that no one else would do.
Interesting. So it's sort of like when the predictable leader is put in place, whether that's politics or corporation or organization, they tend to continue to do the same thing. But when someone who's unfiltered, outside of the norm, I'm thinking of a recent president, because they are so outside of the fold, they are either innovative or destructive.
That's right. And so the one thing I'll say is that's mostly true. But systems are not perfectly static, right? So sometimes the filtered candidate will produce change because that's what the system wants. And then you could have an impact by being an unfiltered person who refuses to change.
Sure.
Right. So it goes both. But in general, you should think that way. That's right.
So you said there's three characteristics. There's external forces, there's internal forces. What was that third characteristic?
Selection systems. Or filtration, in my wording, filtration systems, right? Which I think gives you a better picture of how it actually works.
Yeah. What's the quote? It's not the, and I don't like using gendered terms here, but the quote is, it's not the man that makes the moment, it's the moment that makes the man.
That's right. And so in a lot of, in the social science research and a lot of it, like, that is the consensus. It's not about the person, it's about the situation. And what I said is, most of the time that's true. But when it's not true, it's really not true.
Because the person you've put in is so unfiltered and so outside of the fungible norm.
That's right. Because that they would do things that no one else would do, or even imagine doing.
Yeah.
And I just, saying, most of the time that's a failure.
Sure.
Right. There are more ways to fail than there are to succeed. Like, that's sort of a sad truth about life, right? If you do something and everyone else in the world is saying, I think that's a bad idea, it's probably a bad idea.
Yeah.
When executives ask me, how do I be a high impact leader? I say, look, The Simpsons is the source of all life wisdom. And Marge Simpson once said, it's true that one person can make a difference, but they usually shouldn't.
Dough. I mean, but then you look at what's happened in Ukraine with Zelensky, who's an actor.
That's right.
He's filtered from
he's unfiltered as heck, right? Like, he has no political career before he becomes
no
one saw this coming. And in fact, when the war started, he was incredibly unpopular in Ukraine, right? So this is a tribute to how the second, sort of says one of the things to think about when we think about leadership, right? Is, so I talk about, like, there are paradoxes of leadership. And one of my favorite ones is there's no such thing as the best leader. Right? And what that means is, right, so leadership is not a ranking problem. Leadership is a matching problem.
It's context.
That's right. Everything is always about context. The answer is always about context.
Yes.
And so a person who is perfect in one situation could be disastrous in another.
Yeah.
And so Zelensky, I mean, I know nothing about Ukrainian politics pre-war, but judging by his opinion polls, was not doing well, right? And then the war happens, and it turns out that same set of characteristics for a wartime leader was just a perfect match for the moment. And that's not unheard of. Winston Churchill, Americans and Canadians, everybody thinks of as a sort of gigantic heroic figure for what he did in the Second World War. Legitimately so. I wrote about him in my first book. If you look at his career outside of the Second World War, he's an epic disaster.
Yeah.
Just wrong, basically wrong about everything. And that's because the characteristics that made him a great wartime leader were not useful in any other context.
So interesting. Yeah, context matters. Very good. Okay, so take us, and first, before you take us to picking presidents, so sort of the evolution of your work, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Just a few hellos. So my friend Stuart Hayes is here. Hey, Stuart. Mauricio is here. Danny from Manchester, UK. Kim from Appleton, Wisconsin. Exotic Appleton, Wisconsin. Thank you, Kim. Good to see you here. Brian is here. And Kit. Awesome. Feel free to keep saying hello in the comments. Ask any questions or make any comments from this discussion as we're going through with Gautam here. So Gautam, keep taking us. So that's sort of some of the work you did with Indispensables, more there if you have, and then take us to how your work has evolved into picking presidents. Yeah.
So Indispensable gets published in 2012, and that date is important. I want you to remember this. It was published in 2012. There was nothing about contemporary politics in the book, nothing I could possibly have imagined. But I'm talking about these unfiltered leaders, people who come in from the outside and take over an organization, often over the opposition of the elites of that organization who don't really like them or want them to do it. And well, this, 2016 rolls around and this kind of looks pretty familiar. And so even more than that, in Indispensable, I say, look, if these unfiltered leaders are really, really great or really, really awful, which one is someone likely to be? Can we predict? And the answer is, first, is it's hard. Luck really matters, right? Like, luck is a big component here. But in the first book, what I said was, what you want to be careful about is what I call false signals of performance. Right? So they're characteristics that make someone look very good on first examination. But when you really get to know them, when you get through and find the real person, you're like, no, this is not good.
Yeah, there isn't substance there.
That's right. And so the 4 characteristics that I identified as really like sort of what I said is when you're talking about unfiltered leaders, if you get any one of these 4, you should not give the person the job because the risks are just too high. And the first one were personality and psychological disorders, where the examples I talked about were narcissism and psychopathy.
Yep.
And then I said, well, okay, but also out of the mainstream or highly simplistic ideologies, and extremely risk prone or just straight up incompetent managerial approach, and unearned advantages like inherited wealth.
Got it.
Yeah, so that happened.
We'll call that perfect storm.
So, you know, my editor, who has a sense of humor very similar to my own, was like, so have you thought about writing a book titled "This Wasn't My Fault"? Yeah. But what
hindsight is 2020.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what actually happened was I said, look, I think that I can write a book that will achieve 2 goals. So the first one is let's hone in on the presidency, and let's see if we can really create a framework that would allow anyone, using only information that is contemporaneously available during an election. Mm-hmm. So not like grad students combing through the archives, just what you can get from the New York Times or for Wikipedia, to evaluate a presidential candidate and have, you know, some level of confidence that this person can do the job. Right? So that's the first one. Mm-hmm. And the second one is, the presidency is the leadership position about which we know the most.
Sure.
Right? So there are more books about Abraham Lincoln than any other person who has ever lived except Jesus. Right? The presidency, because of that, is a fantastic laboratory for studying leadership. And so it says, can we take my theories and synthesize them from work from political science and economics and psychology and management and organizational behavior, and really put together, when you use this lens of filtration, can we really figure out a way to get much better at understanding when leaders are going to succeed and when they're going to fail? And that's what this book, and not just presidents, but leaders of all kinds. And that's what the second book's about.
Nice. And it's again, you know, no one really has a crystal ball and is able to predict things like wartime. I mean, you can hypothetically look at, okay, what do we think the moments ahead are going to call for economically, climate, peace, like all these things you can guess, but again, context and luck and scenario happens. Yeah. And you know, Winston Churchill or Zelensky in non-war times, not favorable, and then in war times favorable. So there still is a piece of luck and context.
Luck, I mean, luck always counts. So Hyman Rickover, right, the American admiral who created the nuclear navy, he used to say that luck is better than skill. I can't use you if you're not lucky. Yeah. And you know, this is true. Like, it's just true. You know, in financial markets, luck, because public markets are so efficient. If you see someone who performs really, really well and beats the market, the odds are overwhelming. I mean, thousands to 1 that they are lucky, not skillful.
Yep.
So that, given all that context, luck, context, all these things matter. But what I was trying to do was identify characteristics that, what I would say is, if there was an avenue to success, this person would have found it. Mm-hmm. And I think you can do that. That's the conclusion of the book, is that it is possible to do that pretty consistently. Yeah. And to apply that in a wide variety of domains.
Yeah. So Danny here from the UK says, dark triad, ? Narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. We see this in the UK in populist leaders. Any thoughts there?
Danny is exactly right. So the 2 of the 3 of the dark triad were in the first book. And one of the moments I remember texting with a friend of mine trying to figure out a puzzle in the second book and realizing, oh my God, I was just talking about the dark triad. Absolutely right. All 3 of the personality traits that make up the dark triad are key warning signs for unfiltered leaders, because what they have in common is they create a positive first impression, but generate very large long-term costs.
Yeah.
And so narcissists, if you ever met a real narcissist, you know, on first impression, they're usually quite impressive.
Yeah.
Because their self-belief of their own awesomeness is so strong that you kind of believe it too.
Yeah.
And then after a while, you're sort of, ooh, no. Yeah.
Yeah.
But narcissists make awful leaders because it's the long term that matters for a leader.
I often call it the Steve Jobs vortex of truth, that like someone like a Steve Jobs, and we see these characteristics quite consistently. We're seeing it in Musk, I would argue. We're seeing it in that these leaders, these people who have authority or who are in charge, we know. I just recently posted that power causes brain damage, right? And the way to beat it, and Churchill had this in his wife, who literally sent him a letter saying, I'm afraid that you're too far separated from your constituents, and you're not making sound, good decisions. Michelle Obama says this of Barack when everyone is lauding him as, you know, this amazing person. She says, you know, his feet still stink. Like a humanizing, you know, because power has us move away from the truth. So some of these, you know, I think of Ken Lay from Enron, who is well known to be good at winning others over. But when you go deep into the ethics and deep into how anyone at his level or below her felt of him, not so good. So some of these leaders are so influential that they influence themselves and others. I mean, they're impressed.
So that's definitely true. And I'll split that into some people, right? Some people were never good, right? Like psychopaths are psychopaths, and it's not, as far as we can tell, it's, you know, it's not really treatable. And, you know, in some level you should feel sorry for them because of that, but at a more basic level, you should protect yourself from them. And this is a huge problem. Narcissists are really hard to treat. I mean, as far as I can tell, it seems virtually impossible because, of course, they don't think there's anything wrong. Right? Why would I change? I'm perfect. But yeah, please, nobody take that quote out of context. I did not. But yeah,
you heard it here, folks.
That's right. This is, but what you referenced, Chad, is, I think, incredibly acute. Right? In the literature, it's actually called the power paradox. That getting power actually harms the characteristics that enabled someone to get power in the first place. For about 90% of people, power makes them less empathetic, more Machiavellian, you know, more sexually aggressive. It just makes about 90% of people become worse people when they have power. And so I always say that when you were, okay, so two things. One is that 90% is important because what that tells you is there's 10% of people who aren't affected that way. In fact, they're affected in the opposite direction. They become better people. They become more honest, more altruistic, more community oriented. And so what's really striking about that is what that tells you is it's not that power makes people worse. What it tells you is that power liberates people to be the person they are underneath, right? So they no longer have to pretend to be something they're not because they want power. They can just be who they are because they have power and use it. And most people, that's not good, right? It's not good. The outcome is not good. But for the 10% of people who become better, they seem to self-identify as moral actors. Right? They see themselves, they think of everything they do as a moral choice, and their identity is right. It's about being the person who does the right thing. And so for them, power just liberates them to do the right thing, even when possibly before they might have felt they were pressured by career or whatever not to. And they become better. And so when we think about what tells us about us when we're deciding who to entrust with power, what it tells you is you better be really sure who this person is, right? Who are they underneath when the cameras are off and the pressure is on? What's their real self? Because that's what you're going to get. And if you don't like it, well, you've given them power. You're not going to be able to take it away very easily.
So, all right, hard-hitting question. What does it say about the previous president when we got recording from him that was misogynistic and sexist? We saw the real unfiltered... like, what does it say about society? Now, I understand it's complicated and more people in primaries voted not for Mr. Trump than they did. But in the end, he was the one who was selected. Like, what does that say about, was that just like a resistance to normal politics? And we want, like, help me unpack that one.
So I think we can there's a few things we can say there, right? So let's split this out between regular Trump voters and the Republican Party's elite. So what we know about American politics is partisanship is really powerful. So I wrote articles before the election saying Democrats who are rooting for Trump to get the Republican nomination, because then we'll definitely win, are out of their mind. because partisanship is so powerful that if he does get the nominee, every Republican in America will vote for him. And then anyone could win. And then he could absolutely win. And if you think there's no way that could happen, you do not understand American politics, right? Mm-hmm. And, you know, I've never wanted to be wrong so much in my life, but I wasn't, right? That is actually what happened. And so at the general election, like, that's not surprising to me, right? So I have several, I think quite a few friends actually who voted for Trump. And in general, I'm not, you know, what most of them have in common is they don't really pay that much attention to politics. Right? Like, they vote Republican because they vote Republican. That's what they always do. They vote Republican. And I don't have any problem with that. You know, I think that's I may not agree with that. But if you do that, that's, you know, you voted. Like, I'm glad you voted. Good. You know, that you did your civic duty. And, you know, I'd love to talk to you and say why, you know, X, Y, and Z. And there was, of course, some component of the Trump response was just rage, right? And I mean, look, over the course of the last 40 years of American life, the median income has not really gone up.
Yeah.
Right? Like, in particular, I think the Trump phenomenon is inextricable from the financial crisis and its aftermath, where the American financial system, you know, blew up the entire world economy. And the way we punished the people in it was we gave them lots of money. Right? If you observe that and you are not angry, like, you are one of the people who received the money, right? Yeah. Like, that is literally that is the set of all people who are not angry about what happened. You should be angry. Anger is an appropriate response. Mm-hmm. Now, what it says, if you allow that anger to then vote for someone whose actual behavior in office is to take all of the things that made you angry and do worse, well, then maybe anger, you know, maybe you did not manifest that anger in a productive way. But the anger is legit, you know, legitimate. And I would not say, you know, and obviously that is not to understate the racial elements of what we're going on, which were vast. And I've talked about many, right? And it is very difficult to overstate the importance of race in American politics. All of those things are true. But for the average Trump voter who voted for Trump, you know, not only is it not hard to explain, it would be hard to explain like, that's what happens. People vote party lines in this country.
Yeah.
The people who I have a problem with are the Republican elites, right, who knew what they were doing. And so I'll tell you a story. I was at an offsite. I won't use names, although honestly this person doesn't deserve the protection, but fine. I was at an offsite for an Army unit that cannot be named, right, where they get a bunch of people together to help them think about strategy and things like that. And I meet at this offsite this Republican foreign policy guy. And I have never met him before in my life. This is literally the first time we have ever been in the same room together, right? And this is during the primaries. And he says to me, like, you know, look, Trump's never going to get the nomination. He says it would be an act of madness to allow someone like him to get the Republican Party nomination. We are not crazy. We will never do that. It is inconceivable. I'm looking at the opinion polling. I'm like, hey man, like, I don't think you're right about that, but okay, I'm not a Republican. You tell me. So, but that is his attitude towards Trump, that it is an act of madness to make him the president of the United States, right? If you follow his Twitter feed since Trump got the nomination, it is the most pathetic sycophancy you can possibly imagine towards Trump, right? Like, there is nothing Trump could do that this guy would not praise to the stars as the greatest work of genius that American politics has ever seen. And I'm like, you have no principles of any kind, right? Like it's good for your career, so you support. So those people, the people who sold out, whatever, you know, who knew better, them I have a huge problem with. Mm-hmm. And that is hard. That's hard to deal with, right?
Who sort of leached for their own personal benefit.
Yeah, I mean, like, if you're in politics for like the money, you're doing something wrong. I mean, this is not the play. Like, you know, one of my friends is a congressman, right? So when we went to, I know him because we went to college together. So it's, you know, it's not like I hang out with congressmen, but one of my college classmates happens to be a congressman. I mean, like, I admire him for his dedication to public service. He did 4 tours as a Marine before he went into Congress, and, you know, good for him. But his life sucks, right? Like, it is miserable. He just works so hard. He's fundraising all the time, right? Like he gets, you know, it's really tough. And I'm like, why would you take that on yourself for any motivation other than public service? Because there are easier ways to make money.
Yeah.
And I just don't even understand the people who are in the, you know, who are in politics for themselves. Like, what's the point?
Yeah, there's one that I I know of who we were also in college together. He was a year ahead of me, and we were in similar-ish social circles. He was friends with people that I lived with. And he was a politician then, and he remains to be a politician now. He happens to be the Minister of Education here in Ontario now. And it is so obvious to me that he is not passionate about education. He's passionate about politics and power.
Yeah.
And for anyone who is in leadership for the benefits, for the ego, for the money, or for the power, do us a favor and don't. Just don't do it. Or shame on us for allowing or electing or appointing or making that happen. It's not going to go well.
Yeah.
So yeah. Those four characteristics of sort of unfiltered leaders that we shouldn't pick. So you said personality and psychology, narcissism, psychopathy, highly simplistic point of view, sort of like incompetent management or like a risk tolerance that's too high, and then inherited wealth.
Unearned advantages, where inherited wealth is one example.
Unearned. So then can you just flip it? Like, do you just then do the opposite of it? So psychologically stable, sophisticated, or it's like, do you just flip it to the other end?
So flipping it's a good start, right? Or even just avoiding, right? Like if all you're doing is filtering out people who have those sets of bad characteristics, you've sort of avoided the worst case scenario and you made a lot of progress. So good start.
Yeah.
But I think there are also positive characteristics that you should look for, right? So from the psychological research, particularly the work of the great psychologist Dean Simonton, I'd start by saying there's when he looked at presidents of the United States, at leaders in a wide variety of contexts, what he found was that there's a quality he called intellectual brilliance.
Okay.
That he said is the strongest predictor at the presidency, the only individual level predictor of performance. And his argument was that, so intellectual brilliance is not IQ. They are related, but they are not the same thing, right? So pure horsepower is part of the solution, his solution. But included in that, he says, is like openness to new ideas, broad variety of, like originality, creativity, broad variety of interests. And so what he says is people like that who have the ability to think in many, many different domains. And so if you're thinking, well, why would that be so helpful? The answer is, once you're a leader, right, what you're picked to deal with and what you end up dealing with might not actually have any overlap.
You're thrown curveballs on day one, yeah.
And so people with those sort of broad interests and abilities are much more able to adapt to this new environment than someone who is narrow and rigid and unable to flex. And so when you think about, like, for example, Abraham Lincoln, had only 2 months of formal education before he became president of the United States, is also the only president who has a patent. Right, so that's inventiveness. Like, it's the sort of definition of inventiveness, right? In my new book, In Picking Presidents, my favorite chapter, of course, is on Theodore Roosevelt, because how could it not be? When you say that there is no figure in American history more charismatic than Theodore Roosevelt, he just overwhelms you even across a century of time. So Theodore Roosevelt was unfiltered, right? So he came from a wealthy and powerful family, so that's the mark against him. Mm-hmm. But layered against all those others are all the marks in his favor. So first is, how did he become president? So he was governor of New York, or he'd been a very successful reformist governor of New York. And then the Republican Party barons of the time basically said, we got to get rid of this guy before he cracks down on all the corruption that we're doing so well off of. And he's too popular to be beaten in an election. So we got to find some place where he has absolutely no power whatsoever. I got it. The vice presidency, right? And so they nominate him over his own protest for the vice presidency. He doesn't want to be vice president. He gets railroaded into it. But then, and so the Mark Hanna, the greatest Republican Party baron of his day, was the only person who opposed to this, who said, you understand, there will be only one heartbeat between this madman and the White House. And that's exactly what happened. William McKinley was assassinated and TR becomes president. And then he changes the United States. He changes the world, right? He on the international scene, he builds the Panama Canal. He negotiates the Treaty of Portsmouth to end the Russo-Japanese War and gets the Nobel Peace Prize. On the domestic scene, right, he starts regulating pure food and drugs. He begins antitrust prosecutions. He preserves millions and millions and millions of acres of American wilderness in the national park system. He invents the modern presidency. It is almost impossible, right? I mean, like the sheer scope of what he did is so gargantuan, it's kind of hard to process. And And then even this is my sort of, even if your kids have a teddy bear, the teddy bear is named after Theodore Roosevelt. Because he went out on a hunting expedition and refused to kill a bear cub that his guides found, and this became a cartoon that then became a toy that that kids will have until the end of time. So that's Theodore Roosevelt, right? But if so, weighed against he is from a wealthy and powerful family, is everything else about him. So in terms of intellectual brilliance, so before he became president, right, he had already written, and he became president in his early 40s. He's the youngest person ever to become president. He had already written 12 books. Multiple of those books are considered all-time classics, right? His very first book, a history of the Naval War of 1812, which he wrote while he was in college, so was so good that even though it was written by an American from an American perspective, the Royal Navy made it required reading for its officers.
Wow.
In college. Right? I mean, I would say that there's nothing will ever make you feel more inferior in life than going through TR's, the chronology of his life, being like, what did he do by age X? And then comparing to what you did by age X and being,
I'm behind.
That doesn't measure up. Yeah. So if he has the ability to speak on equal terms with experts, as they said, in fields ranging from cowpunching to protective coloration. He has been not just a war hero, although it was awarded posthumously because the army didn't want to give extra awards to these volunteers. He is the recipient of the Medal of Honor. He is the only person ever to receive both their country's highest military decoration and the Nobel Peace Prize. Right? And he led a regiment in Cuba with extraordinary success. He'd been a successful police commissioner, a successful U.S. Civil Service commissioner, a successful governor of New York. Like, he demonstrated an extraordinary range of broad capabilities and an extraordinary level of managerial skill.
Yeah.
That if you were going to bet on a horse, Theodore Roosevelt is the guy you bet on.
Yeah.
That's why.
So it's this. So I hear intellectual brilliance. I'm hearing flexibility, versatility, like a learnedness or a learning or like a learning organization.
Creativity, curiosity, very much so. Yes, exactly that. Yeah.
Nice. Very good. Very cool. There's a great post here from Danny as well. Marcus Aurelius supposedly hired an assistant to follow him, whisper in his ear. When praised, you're just a man. You're just a man. We were speaking before around narcissism and psychopathy, and I've been taught, and I believe it, that arrogance is a form of insecurity just expressed loudly. And I think one of the ways that we can potentially deal with narcissism or arrogance is candor with care, is having someone in our corner who lets us know when we're getting over the edges of our skis.
So I think it's true in some cases, but not all.
Mm-hmm.
So there seem to be two types of narcissism. The people who project this outward narcissism to cover up their internal insecurity.
Yeah.
And the people who are narcissistic kind of all the way down.
Sure.
And that's a real type. And so one is, as I said, narcissists don't really seem to be all that treatable, right? Like I'm not sure anything helps. Mm-hmm. My advice to people when they're dealing with narcissists is don't. That's actually
just avoid, ignore, move away, separate from,
But also, differentiating between which of those two types of narcissists you're talking about is also quite difficult, I think.
Yeah. Interesting. So there's sort of one that it's just so they're the real pure chocolate milk, and then there's the one where you add the powder. Got it. Okay. So please keep any final questions or comments going. We're going to land this plane shortly here. And thank you, Gautam, for joining us on what is a very busy day in your world. A couple of questions I have. So I know here in Canada, we have a parliamentary system. We have multiple parties. It works and doesn't both at the same time. In the US, you have two major parties. There's been sort of independents that have emerged. But my sort of two questions for you is, A, can there legitimately be more than red and blue in the US? And bonus question, if you were to take out your magic Gautam wand and literally redraw up this entire system, how would you do it? What is the utopian political system for a country like America? Because what works for Slovakia might not work for America.
Yeah.
USA. Yeah.
So, okay. So first one is, can there be a third party in the United States? The answer is no. I mean, like, I know people try all the time, but the answer is no, there can't. The way our political structures are set up in such a way that the rewards for being either first or second are so gargantuan that it is essentially impossible, right? The only way you can get a third party is if it is actually a second party, because one of the first two parties collapses. That's what's happened in 1856 with when the Republicans replaced the Whigs, who just dissolved.
So there can be another party, but it's at the dismay and crumbling of one of the two.
Right. Yeah.
Got it.
And it's just like, even if you think a third party would be good for the country, which I'm pretty ambivalent about, it's not possible. Even, like when Mike Bloomberg was thinking about doing it, there were discussions about it where, he could have easily have spent, say, $2 billion running on a third party ticket. So he could have outspent anybody, because Mike Bloomberg has that kind of, like, for him, $2 billion is not a lot of money.
Sure.
And even then, what he would have done is spent $2 billion to come in third in 50 states. Like, that's what he would have done.
And the incentives to be third are so
zero,
non-existent that, again, you could create a third to be the second.
That's right.
Got it. Okay.
And so, the closest anyone has ever come to doing it is, of course, Theodore Roosevelt, who in 1912 ran on a third party ticket and actually did manage to come in second, beating the incumbent president. But he was Theodore Roosevelt. He had already had 2 terms as president of the United States. Whoever you are out there thinking you want to lead a third party, I assure you, you are not Theodore Roosevelt. So that's and then so Shed, give me your second question.
The second question is, you have your Gautam magic wand. Yeah. How would you make changes? Like, if you were to build this political system from the ground up, what would you make?
I would, but cautiously. So the first thing to say is that, we can criticize the American government for endlessly. I am happy to do so, and do, often enough that my wife sort of rolls her eyes. There are many things you could say that we could do better. Right? This is not a defense of the American status quo, but I always want to start that by saying you need to frame the discussion with where we are. The United States is the wealthiest, most powerful society in human history. It is not close. My wife is from Sweden. Sweden is a wonderful country. I visited it for the first time this summer with her. Beautiful, love the place. Great life expectancy is amazing. Everything's it's remarkable. If Sweden were a state of the United States, its per capita income would be equivalent to Missouri, which is not in any way, shape, or form a wealthy U.S. state. It's a wonderful U.S. state. My college roommate was from Missouri, but it's not rich, right? Sweden would be a poor state in the United States. So Americans, especially, but I think also people from outside the United States, often forget that the scale of the success of the American system over the course of 2 centuries is genuinely quite hard to process. Mm-hmm. That's not saying that we've delivered for everybody. We haven't, right? If you were Black American for most of American history, you would not have said, "Oh, this society is awesome." No, I'm not. This is not an argument that you were. But even there, right, the circle of inclusion has expanded. So, however, the situation is clearly not great, but it's better than it was 30 years ago. So at least there's that to be said.
Yeah.
So when I would say to make changes, is I say, like, well, yes, I mean, I think there are lots of changes I would make, but I'd be pretty cautious before you tweak a system that works that well. People routinely say that parliamentary systems work better than presidential ones. Mm-hmm. And there are reasons to believe that. It's certainly true that parliamentary systems are much more highly filtered than presidential ones. It's much harder to get an unfiltered prime minister in Canada or the United Kingdom.
Just because there's more selection.
That's right. There is.
Yeah.
But the U.S., when it's had disastrous unfiltered presidents, but it's also had Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, right? Like there was a sequence in the United States where the president of the United States from 1933 on was Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, and Dwight Eisenhower. Any country in the world would look at those 3 and be like, I will trade you, right? Like, I will take my leader and we'll swap 1 for 1 and get one of those 3. And that's 20 years. That's 1933, or not 20 years. What am I saying? 1933 all the way up to 1961.
Yeah.
It's a long stretch of hyper competent government, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the system isn't as bad, whatever's going on.
Wouldn't it be funny, by the way, if it was like a sports team and You know, the UK could say, "Give us Eisenhower."
That's right.
Yeah.
So you know, the system is obviously not, you know, like I would be the first to say the system is not doing well right now. And you know, it is election day and we're having this conversation. When it says I am more concerned that the system is about to break than I would have been at any point in American history since the 1860s. Right? Like I do not know if American democracy will survive out the next 10 years. I don't, and no one does it. No one, anyone who tells you they do know is telling you they don't understand the situation. The situation is that grave. But I would still be very cautious about making changes. If I did, there are a few I'd have in mind. Yeah.
Okay.
So the small stuff that is actually totally doable, and you know, is I would reform the powers of the presidency. The president, for example, should not have the power to launch a full nuclear first strike at his or her whim, right? It's just not a good idea to give a single individual human the power to end human civilization because they feel like it.
Yeah.
Just don't do that, right? No. We can take that out of the equation just by passing a law. I would reform, you know, I'd reform the power of the presidency to declare states of emergency, to sort of sanction people for being terror, right? So there, you know, I would create an independent arm of the U.S. government modeled on the Federal Reserve to do anti-corruption investigations, because it's just too easy, as Donald Trump demonstrated, to try and sick the Justice Department on your political enemies. And as he's saying right now, that's what he wants to do, and he tried to do it when he was president too. And that is where tyranny comes from, right? When the government turns on its political enemies and uses the power of the state against them. So all of that is done with legal changes, and I actually think it would not be that difficult.
And those are just a couple of two key systems.
That's right.
On things that are of significant ramification or of personal interest.
You're just trying to avoid the catastrophes, right? Like when you're already the richest society in human history, the game you're playing is don't screw up, right? Like don't lose what you've got.
Yeah.
And so I would reform the nomination system to give the party elites a little bit more of a voice. Because it was really clear in 2016 that the Republican Party elites did not want to elect Donald Trump, right? They just felt that they didn't have a way to stop it, and if they tried, they would be destroyed, and he would still win. So if they'd had a way to stop it, would they have done it? I don't know. At the time, I thought they would have. Now, I got to say, my faith in them is pretty greatly eroded, so maybe not. But at least the option should be on the table.
Yeah.
More basic constitutional reforms. The founding fathers were actually really embarrassed by the Senate, right? They were sort of forced down their throat, but when you actually read their discussions of the Senate, they're like, this is ridiculous. You can see them saying this is ridiculous, and we don't actually think it's a good idea. Same thing with the Electoral College. So you would want to do major reforms there. Another reform you could do just by changing the law, you would not need constitutional change, is I would greatly increase the size of the House of Representatives. I would probably triple it in size, make those people much closer to the people, make districts small enough that you could actually campaign in a district retail without needing huge amounts of donation, sort of dollar donations in order to do campaign ads. That would be huge. That would also decrease the bias in the Electoral College towards rural states, because urban states would get many more members of the House. So that'd be a thing. If you wanted to do like wave the magic wand and do huge constitutional changes, right? You do a big change with the Senate, you'd make it more representative of the population. The thing I would probably do is make every election happen on every 4 years on the same day. So I would take senators and make them 4 years instead of 6. I would take Congress and make them 4 years instead of 2, and just have every office in the U.S. government turn over every 4 years, because midterms, what we see, have really sort of negative effects where the president essentially cannot govern with a mandate because it's always confused as to who exactly the people want to be in charge.
Yeah. Interesting. So not huge demolition, crazy renovations, but more rounding some edges, expanding some rooms. Neat. Very cool. Wonderful. One more question, and then I want to hit something from the comments, and then we will wrap this and thank Gautam for joining us. Here's a question for you. If democracy ceases to exist, if it's so fragile that it literally fails in the United States of America, what happens?
Nothing good. So the first thing is, the U.S. government is not older than the governments of, say, France, Germany, Italy. It's older than all of them combined, right? It's been around for a really long time. To an extent that I think most people in the world really do not understand, the basic underlying systems of the world are undergirded by the government of the United States to an extent that is so total that it's like asking fish about water. It's just where they are. But, you sort of, the number of examples is kind of endless, right? So in East Asia, right, where you see lots of states that have relatively low defense spending and, are able to grow hugely. Well, a big explanation for that was because U.S. troops in Japan and South Korea were sort of guaranteeing the peace, and so nobody had to spend money on their defense budgets because they didn't want to. They didn't need to, because like if they were attacked, the U.S. would defend them, but the U.S. wouldn't help them attack someone else, so they weren't a threat to other countries. Enormous policy triumph that paid dividends for literally billions of people that people don't even think about. On the extent to which the financial system is just undergirded by the U.S. So, for example, the only riskless asset are U.S. Treasury bills. Now, I do not think that they should be riskless assets, because I think there's a real chance that the Republican Party is going to force a default in the next couple of years. But that is the way. Like, when you take a finance class, we literally price things versus T-bills because they are assumed to have zero risk of default. Okay, so that's the level of faith that the world's financial system has put in, that the U.S. government will know what it is doing. In COVID-19, even under Donald Trump, not exactly a paragon of managerial genius, that the China and the United States both raced to produce vaccines, but the Chinese vaccines don't work, right? They had barely a 50% effectiveness rate. The American vaccines do work. They have incredibly effective. And, well, this is sort of where the U.S. government often falls down, right? Is when the Chinese donate vaccines, or usually what they do is they're selling vaccines, and it's sort of, it's on the evening news in whatever country they go from. Something like 90% of all vaccines donated in the world have been donated by the United States government. We don't talk about it. So if democracy falls in the United States, and it's amazing and horrifying to me that you can say that and have it be a realistic conversation, the rest of the world will go with us. It will be bad for everyone in a way that it's really hard to comprehend. In the worst case scenario, the Roman Empire, right, was a brutal, genocidal, militaristic dictatorship. Right? I mean, all you really need to know about how awful it was to be conquered by the Romans, right? How brutal the Romans were, was they had a word for to kill every 10th person. Right? Think about how often you have to do it before you need a word for it, right? But when the Roman Empire fell, the population of the territories ruled by Rome declined by 2/3. When empires fall, everybody suffers.
Yeah. A Cautionary Tale by Gautam Mukunda. Well, let's hope it doesn't get to that, and I will donate to that concert called Save Democracy, called 1-888, don't F up. A joy for us to join you. I see one final question here from my new friend Sean Gates, a little bit disconnected from like the overall picking presidents conversation, but certainly dealing with tough leaders. What's the best manner to deal with a micromanager? I have a few thoughts. Do you want to go first?
You go first, Chad.
So I think first and foremost, so when you're dealing with someone who's a micromanager, do they mean well? Is their intent solid? I've had micromanagers that they just don't know any better. And I can actually, because there's enough psychological safety and trust in the conversation, I can earn their trust. I can give them feedback and it's safe. And there's actually a way in which we can grow from it. Or, on the whole, I trust that they are good and have my best interest at heart. Then there's a micromanagement relationship where it's actually a toxic relationship. And I would define a toxic relationship as one in which the more you invest in it, the worse it gets. And the only person who can take responsibility is you. Versus a healthy relationship, the more you invest in it, the better it gets. And so if you report into someone who's a micromanager, but you would call it a healthy relationship, there's hope. If you report into someone who's a micromanager and it's a toxic relationship, run far away. Gautam?
Yeah, that would be pretty much exactly my response as well. Is why is this person a micromanager, right? Is it from a basic sense of insecurity that if they do not supervise everything, it's going to be a disaster, right? And even that can be driven, is it because they're just so worried and you haven't earned their faith yet, and eventually you will and they'll back off? Or is it, they have, the most stereotypical is they have control issues, right? They just cannot imagine anybody doing, and this is something that, it's something the militaries deal with all the time, right? Because like bad commanders are micromanagers, and that doesn't mean a good commander is hands off, but it means they know when to that. There's an old line that the British officers, right, have an exam, and one of the questions for a British officer is, how do you dig a trench? And the right answer is to say, Sergeant, dig me a trench. Right? It's not your job.
Yeah.
And that sort of training of, if you, I always want to ask about people, of supervisors who are that aggressive about micromanaging, is, if you don't trust these people to do the job, why did you hire them?
Yeah.
And what does it say about you that, you selected them and yet you still cannot afford them that? Like, I think that might be the more fundamental issue.
Yeah. I've heard there's a standard in the U.S. Marines, and maybe you can confirm or deny this, but I've heard, it's not written anywhere, but a standard is that if you are a leader of Marines, you must find affection toward those Marines. The way I interpret that is you must see that there's strength and genius in the people that you lead. If you cannot find strength or genius in the people that you lead, I have news for you. You aren't fit to lead them.
Yeah. Right? So I have not heard that, but it sounds exactly right.
Yeah. Well, and to say that you're an ideal leader for every single human being on the planet would be a fallacy.
Yeah.
I think, again, context matters. So with that, Gautam, thank you so much for joining us. The new book is Picking Presidents. I love the subtitle as well. How to make the most consequential decision in the world. Say that 7 times fast. Any final words or things you can point us toward to learn more, Gautam?
Well, you mentioned my podcast, Shed. Thanks very much for that. I am the host and creator of World Reimagined with Gautam Mukunda, which is sponsored by NASDAQ and is on podcasts anywhere in the world. I am at gmukunda, at GMUKUNDA on Twitter, and I would love to hear from any one of you.
Amazing. Have a great time at the book launch event in Washington, D.C. today. If you are in the D.C. area, go crash the party. And thank you again for joining us. Look forward to seeing you next time, my friend.
Thank you. Look forward to it, Chad.
Awesome. Thanks.
Bye.